Are you ready for the word? Yeah. You better be, because I am ready to preach it. John 11, verses 1 through 7 is where we will begin our time. John 11, 1 through 7. Many of you may have heard this story, and I pray that you would have some enlightenment today as we read it and as I come to the text a little deeper. John 11, let's read it all the way through here. It says, "Now a man named Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. This Mary, whose brother Lazarus now lay sick, was the same one who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. So the sisters sent word to Jesus, 'Lord, the one you love is sick.' When he heard this, Jesus said, 'This sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it.' Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days. And then he said to his disciples, 'Let us go back to Judea.' After he had said this, he went on to tell them, 'Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I'm going there to wake him up.' So then he told them plainly, 'Lazarus is dead, and for your sake I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him.'" Let me show you what happens when he arrives in verses 17 through 22. On his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Now, Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed home. "Lord," Martha said to Jesus, "if you'd have been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask." I want to pause the text there before we pick it up later. I want to preach from the subject titled, "If and When." If and when. Depending on how we use the word if, makes a whole mindset out of things. I find myself using if like this most of the time. What if? And I think it can tend to be used more negatively and focusing on what's wrong than anything else. Let's see if you can hear yourself in my thoughts. What if? What if I don't have what it takes? Have you ever thought that before? What if I make the wrong call? Have you ever thought that before? What if I make the wrong decision? What if I jack up my kids? What if this thing gets worse? What if something delays? What if it doesn't happen the way I thought it would? What if in your life? What if I get fired? What if they leave me? What if I can't afford the payment? What if things don't get better? When I read this story, I can hear the what ifs going on behind the scenes. What if Lazarus doesn't get better? What if our messenger can't find Jesus to bring him here? What if Jesus can't make it in time? What if the sickness gets worse? What if this thing gets worse? I know it's bad, but the worry I have is what if it worsens? And now we have the tension of the moment rising because the sisters are operating under a sense of urgency. It's clear that Lazarus doesn't have much time left. He's battling this sickness, and timing is of the essence. And timing is everything. And the clock is ticking, and time is running out on Lazarus' life. What if Jesus doesn't make it in time? Mary and Martha send a messenger, according to verse 2, to let Jesus know about Lazarus. Now, I want you to lean in really carefully and listen to everything I'm about to say, because maybe, just maybe, the thing that you have interpreted this story to mean might not be as accurate as what John had in mind when he wrote it. The messenger leaves Bethany, which is the city where Mary, Martha, and Lazarus reside. And when you look at where chapter 10 of John ends, as Jesus escapes and goes to a new location, then you will find that because of where Jesus is geographically, it takes the messenger 2 days to get to where Jesus is, because Jesus is between 20 and 100 miles away from the town of Bethany. Time is ticking, and the sisters worry, what if this gets worse? Once the messenger arrives to Jesus, he informs him of the request. It will take, at this point in our story, 2 additional days to get back to Lazarus. What if there's a delay in the journey? Jesus stays where he is 2 days and then makes the journey to Bethany where Lazarus is. Now, the most critical piece of information that we have comes to light, which we read in verse 22. Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days, completely embalmed and mummified, and quite literally dead as a doornail. So then the question is this: when would Jesus have had to leave in order to get to Lazarus while Lazarus was still alive but sick? The answer, according to what we see geographically and in the details of the narrative, is that he would have had to have left at the same time the messenger originally left if he was going to get to Lazarus before he died. Because when the messenger arrived where Jesus was, Lazarus died at that moment when Jesus received the news. The reason that this is important to note is because we oftentimes read the story and think that Jesus intentionally stayed where he was so that Lazarus would die and Jesus could come resurrect him. But that's not true. Because of the physical distance between where Jesus is and where Lazarus is, even if Jesus left immediately, Lazarus would have been dead 2 days instead of 4. And 2 days in a tomb, or 4 days in a tomb, is still talking about a person being dead. But what can't be in question is if Lazarus would have still been alive. Do you see that in the text? Are you following me? Which means that there was no version of this story where Jesus could have gotten to Lazarus when Lazarus was sick and therefore would not have been able to rescue him from dying, because he never would have made it to Lazarus in time before he died. So Jesus didn't allow Lazarus to die and could not have prevented it had he left sooner, but he chose to go even when Lazarus was dead. It would be easy to assume that Jesus' motive for staying was so that Lazarus would move from sick to death and he could raise him from the grave. But with all the details at hand, that wasn't his motive. And that brings us to a much bigger question. What is John trying to teach us about Jesus? What is John trying to teach us about Jesus' motive for going? when he would have never been able to arrive while Lazarus was sick? And the answer is this, that Jesus is willing to go the distance when everything is at its worst. That in your life, Jesus is willing, sometimes when you think he's waiting. Jesus wasn't waiting for it to get worse. Jesus was willing to go even when things were at their worst. You can't interpret the text wrong because Jesus was willing, he was ready, he was eager, he was prepared to do something. Now, we don't know why he stayed there for 2 days. He did have work to do, but the point I want you to see is that even if he left, that there still would have been a Lazarus who had already died. And the willingness is what we have to look for, because most people, in fact, all people, would not have made the trip. They would have been unwilling to go, to even see the sisters and Lazarus at this point. When everyone else would have been unwilling to get involved, Jesus is willing to cover the distance in order to make a difference. And the distance you see between you and Jesus is not detrimental to your story. That the distance you see between you and Jesus is not what Jesus sees. That the distance doesn't overwhelm Jesus as a problem that he is not able to overcome. That he chose to go the distance because he knows that there's nothing too big for him in the first place. Which means that the power in the text is that Jesus chose to go anyway. That the comfort in the text is knowing that Jesus chooses willingly to go, and the revelation comes from knowing that when you send word to Jesus, when something in your life is sick, that even if it gets worse, Jesus is still able to walk into the worst of situations and bring dead things to life. That's the point of the story. And I got to think that maybe the sisters thought that it was over. And when they thought that it was over, Jesus was on the way. Just when you think it might be over, maybe, just maybe, Jesus is on the way. That Jesus was not unwilling, but he was willing to go. And he walked a 2-day journey knowing that there were dead things that other people didn't believe that he could resurrect. That maybe while you're waiting, Jesus is working. That maybe while you're waiting, maybe Jesus is walking. That maybe while you're sitting there, Jesus is on the move. That maybe when you thought that he was unwilling, he's actually set the miracle in motion, and hope and help and resurrection power is on the way. That God doesn't cause all bad things to happen, but God takes all things and he works them together for the good of those who love him. And in this, we see that he loves Lazarus, and he loves Mary, and he loves Martha. And he did not have to rush immediately to leave as soon as he got word and run as fast as he could, because he was anxious that if Lazarus just so happened to get worse and move from sickness unto death, that there would be no option for him to get to work and perform a miracle. He knew with utter confidence that he didn't have to rush with anxiety, that he didn't have to get to stepping right then and there, that he was in his own time frame able to calmly walk, because even if Lazarus moves from alive to dead, I can still bring him back to life. That's the power of the text. And you can hear it once we get to Martha, who says, Lord, if you would have been here. You know, oftentimes we think that she's blaming him. But I just gave you the timeline about the way the chronology of events took place. She's more thinking, what if I would have sent that messenger sooner? What if he could have arrived a little bit faster? She's in what if mode. What if feelings? Lord, if you could have been here sooner. Now there's comfort here, and she loves him and he loves her, and there's a grieving, and he's present for it, and he's sitting there as her friend. But I want you to see something that is so powerful inside of this. Please don't miss it. That she says inside of this text, but I know that even now, God will give you whatever you ask. Martha moves in her heart in a way that we have to move in our hearts. She moves, Lord, if. What if he would have been here sooner? She moves from what if feelings to even if faith. That she now says, even if you're later than what I thought it took for you to be here, you can still work a miracle on my behalf. That she moves from what if he's delayed to even if he's delayed and he's not in my time frame, that I know that God will still give him whatever it is that he asks. That there will come a point in time where God will take you through so many things that you will have to realize that you cannot what if all the way through to the end, but you will have to even if all your way to the end. And that is the point that the story is making. I want you to turn your what if questions into even if statements. Even if he shows up later, even if he's delayed, even if I don't see it, even if I don't know, I can still trust him. I know he'll be here. I know he'll show up. I know it's going to happen. I don't have to, what if he doesn't, as if it's all up to you and me. And Mary teaches us that she trades this idea. What if? Even if. Even if. Even if. Because this would mean that everything rode on her to make it happen. This whole thing would be quite cruel if she would have just sent the messenger 2 or 3 or 4 days sooner, and that Jesus would have moved a little quicker. Then everything would be okay. Then all the pressure's on Martha. And the point of this story is that when you send your request to God, you have even if faith, God, even if it doesn't look like what I thought it would, I still believe that you can take things in my life and raise them that were dead back to life. Here's what I'm telling you, is that when you have even if faith, God has even when miracles. Because this whole thing is showing up inside of Ephesians chapter 2, 4, and 5, when it says, because of his great love for us, God, who is rich in mercy, made us alive with Christ even when we were dead in transgressions. This whole thing is showing that even when Lazarus was dead, that he was made alive with Christ. That even when there are certain things that don't look like they're supposed to, that God is still able and still with you all the way in your story. Are you following what I'm saying this morning? That Jesus is walking even when you're weeping, because he's willing to work with you at your worst. And even if you could have done this or you could have gone that, God's not saying you have to make it all just perfect every step of the way and look back in your past at the little things you could have adjusted here, there, and everywhere. And what if I would have done, and what if I could have done, and what if it would have gone this way, and what if it could have gone that way. He's saying, Even if sometimes you go left, I'm still willing to get with you down in that. This is like a Daniel-like even if. Daniel, it says in Daniel chapter 3, verse 18, but even if he doesn't rescue us from this situation, Daniel says, we want to make it clear to you that we will never serve your gods or worship the gold statue you have set up. Even if faith is where God shows off with even when miracles. Even when you're at the worst, even when we're dead in sin, even when the dream is gone, even when you feel like it's hopeless, that God's not predicating his power on our perfect performance 24/7. Even if. Can you trade in your what if feelings for even if faith? Because she says if, when, if and when. And here's what I love. That maybe, just maybe, a divine delay is not necessarily a divine denial. That Jesus is delayed in his journey. And that might have been misinterpreted to mean that Martha was denied in her request. But a divine delay is not always a divine denial. That even if he is delayed, I know that even when he shows up, I'm not going to be denied. That as he's delayed in his journey, he is still able and powerful enough to work the miracle when something is at its worst. And if you're in a season where you feel like God has delayed, don't misinterpret God's delay as God's denial upon your request. That Martha wasn't denied and Jesus was still on the move. And though he was delayed, she would one day quite quickly see that his power was going to be made perfect in this weak moment, and she would still serve him. What you have to do to get even if faith is adopt the mind of Christ. And the way you adopt the mind of Christ is interpret the narrative from his perspective. Verse 11, he says to his disciples, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I am going there to wake him up. Jesus wants to give us the gift of perspective because Jesus is willing to walk to Bethany. He already knows what he's going to do when he gets there. He's going to raise Lazarus from the dead. So he informs the disciples that Lazarus is asleep. Now everyone knows Lazarus is dead, but the point that Jesus wants to make is that he sees things differently than we do. That he doesn't see Lazarus as dead because dead people don't come back to life. He sees Lazarus as asleep because asleep people can be woken up. So if he sees Lazarus as asleep, even though everyone else sees Lazarus as dead, what does this teach us about Jesus? That Jesus sees things differently than we do. What you see as something dead in your life, Jesus sees as sleeping. What if the thing you think is dead, God just says, no, it's just sleep. From my perspective, it's just asleep, because that's good news when something is asleep, because it can be woken up. You see a dead dream, Jesus sees a sleeping dream. You see a dead relationship, Jesus sees a sleeping relationship. You see a dead life, Jesus says, I can wake that life up at any point in time that I start walking into it. You send word and I will wake it up. That Jesus sees it differently than you do. And if Jesus can wake up a man that's been dead 4 days, then Jesus can wake up anything in your life that's fallen asleep. What has fallen asleep that only Jesus can revive? Maybe it's not dead. Maybe it's dormant. Are y'all awake today? This is a rich, thick word, I understand, but listen to me. What you see maybe as dead, God sees maybe as just dormant. And I've spent a great deal of time the last few weeks talking about dormant things as Jesus has personally woke me up this last month. But I can't help but think that this is in the narrative to show us that Jesus is able to revive dormant souls, just like water is able to revive dormant seeds. And I'm talking about anything in you that feels asleep right now, that feels like it's in hibernation mode, taking a long winter's nap, that thing that has been out cold for too long, that thing might just be dormant, and God has you in the right place to wake it up. You know what you have to do, right? Instead of think, what if I missed it all those years ago and now it's too dead for God to revive? Even if I did miss it a few years ago, I know that He's still powerful enough to step into that dead place and wake it up to life. That even if I took a wrong turn, that even if I could have sent word sooner, that even if I could have got to work quicker, that even if I could have done a better job, that even if I could have made a different decision, that because I say now, God, would you get involved, that His power is powerful enough to say, even when it's dead and gone, I can wake it back up again. Do you have even if faith? Verse 25, Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this, he says. Now this is the whole point of the spiritual implications of this physical miracle. That Jesus wanted to do for Lazarus what He wanted to do for the world spiritually. That even though some would die spiritually, that He is the resurrection and the life, and whoever comes to Him and believes in Him will live and never die. That the most detrimental thing to death is Jesus. That death dies when Jesus gets around it. That dead things stop being dead when Jesus gets involved. That dead things quit dying and reverse the curse of death as soon as Jesus gets involved. Why do we wait to call out to God and ask Him to get involved when we put all the pressure on ourselves that we could have done, should have done, would have done in the past? And Jesus says, I work really well with things that are entombed for days on end. As soon as you send the request, I want to get involved, because He reverses death and makes dead things live. There's nothing that can do that other than the power of Jesus. Even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this? She says, yes, Lord. Verse 27, I believe you are the Messiah, the Son of God who is to come into the world. After she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary. The teacher is here, and He's asking for you. When Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to Him. Now, Jesus had not yet entered the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met Him. When the Jews who had been with Mary in the house, comforting her, noticed how quickly she got up and went out, they followed her, supposing she was going to the tomb to mourn there. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw Him, she fell at His feet and said, Lord, same thing, if you had been here. If we could have made it happen faster, if you could have been here. I know you were there, but what if you could have been here? Well, then my brother would not have died. When Jesus saw her weeping and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, He was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Jesus in His humanity wants to comfort people when their emotions are broken. That He shows Himself a friend right here. that in his soul he aches and he grieves with her. That 2 Corinthians says he's the God of all comfort who comforts us in our times of trouble. That he was so human in this moment that he could feel the pain and experience the grief. And what that means is that any point in time where you are grieving and you are mourning and you are in trouble, Jesus walks up and he is deeply moved in his spirit with you in every one of those moments. That he's not so godlike that he's detached. But he's so like us that he can feel it. But he's so unlike us, he can do something about it. That's the good news. That he's both friend and God. And the friend is in the first half to comfort those who weep. And God is in the second half to do the impossible. He says, "Where have you laid him?" "Come and see, Lord," they replied. Verse 35, that famous verse, 2 words, Jesus wept. There's where we see his humanity grieving his friend. The Jews said, "See how he loved him." And of course they doubt. But some of them said, "How could he not? Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" It's like insulting Jesus right before he gets to work. Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. "Take away the stone," he said. "But Lord," said Martha, the sister of the dead man, "by this time there is a bad odor, for he has been there 4 days." Now this was the same Martha that in verse 27 replied to Jesus when asked, "Do you believe this?" And she says, "Yes, Lord." Now that she says, "Yes, Lord, I believe this. You are the resurrection and the life." "Yes, Lord." Now we start walking and things get real and we're at the tomb. And he actually gives a command, "Roll away the stone." And she goes, "But Lord." Well, just a few verses ago it was, "Yes, Lord." But now when things are actually getting real and rubber meets the road, it's, "But Lord." You know, oftentimes I watch us as Christians say, "Yes, Lord," on Sunday, and we move into "But Lord" on Monday. "Do you believe it?" "Yes, Lord." And we get out there in the world and he goes, "We'll take away the stone." "But Lord." "But Lord." The situation's rotten. And the whole thing stinks. And yeah, I believe it, but Lord, are you sure about this one? Martha shows us that it's okay to be incongruent at times. Because she is, "Yes, Lord," in one moment, and "But Lord," the very next. But listen to me. It's not how we feel about what God says that gets the miracles accomplished. It's what we do. Take away the stone. If the stone doesn't come away, then there is not an obedience to the word of God, of what he's asking her to do. Because it's not about our faith, "Yes, Lord." It's about our feet, "But Lord." Can our faith and our feet match? Can our lips and our life match? Can we be congruent when it comes to the point and realize that when God says, "Will you remove that stone from your heart that I might move in that area that you call dead?" "Oh, I know, but it's a bad odor. Been there 4 days." Verse 40, you got to hear it. Then Jesus said, "Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" Some of y'all need to hear that word. Because in the beginning of the story, he says, this sickness will not end in death. In verse 40, he says, "Did I not tell you? Did I not tell you that when God makes a promise, he makes good on that promise?" He says, this sickness won't end in death. Well, some of us have this construct. We're like, "Well, but he's dead." Well, yeah, but in Jesus' perspective, again, he sees things differently than we do. And so he sees things one way and we see things another way. Aristotle had a principle inside of plays and acting that said this: the end is never the end. That there's an intermission portion, and there's a twist and a turn portion where it looks like it's the end, but it's not actually the end. That playwrights have a way of writing things where the end is never really the end. And with Jesus, he was a master at helping people understand that the end is never really the end. Because, if I'm not mistaken, it's Jesus himself that goes to a cross on Friday, and everybody thinks it's the end. And when he goes on a Friday and he gets into his own tomb on Saturday, everybody thinks it's the end. But I think I got the story right, if I'm not mistaken, that early Sunday morning, when everybody else thought it was the end, he had a, "Did I not tell you that I am the resurrection and the life, that I don't operate in the time frame that people operate in, that this won't end the way you think it will"? What if the situation right now that you've predicted the worst? Jesus is saying, I'm telling you, I can take that situation because I'm willing to walk and to work in the worst. And he's communicating to you now that your Lazarus thing that you think is dead, that your Lazarus relationship that feels hopeless, that the dream in the tomb that feels like no way out, that the thing in your soul that feels like it's been dormant for years on end, that the entombed and enshrined, stinking, smelly part that you don't want anybody to see, that you've already said there's no way, that he says it doesn't have to end in death because I see it as sleeping. Did I not tell you that this won't end this way? Even if he shows up at a different part in the story, it's about his ability and his power to perform the miracle. That when we have even if faith, God shows off with even when miracles. So that you have a story worth telling, even when I thought it was hopeless, even when I didn't see a way out, even when everybody told me to leave him, even when everyone said it's over, even when there was no way out of that, even when it looked like bankruptcy was the only, even when they called me dumb for believing God on that dream, even when, that's when God showed up at the bare bucket bottom of my story, because he is willing to work in the worst situations. And worst is relative. It's not comparative. It's relative to you. Can you, God, even if, I believe you could still move in this one right here. That's even if faith. So they took away the stone, and then Jesus looked up and said, Father, I thank you that you heard me. I knew that you always hear me. But I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me. When he had said this, Jesus called in a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. Verse 44. The dead man came out. Jesus, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. Jesus said to them, take off the grave clothes and let him go. Stand with me this morning as I close. Jesus, as they roll away the stone, he says, Lazarus, come out. Lazarus, come out. You know what's wild? He doesn't just say, come out. He doesn't say, come out. He's staring at a hillside where there's many, 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 many tombs all over the hillside. And Lazarus is the one tomb that we're talking about right here. And he specifically and intentionally calls the name of Lazarus so that Lazarus would come out. Because he's so powerful to work with dead things. He's so powerful with his resurrection life. He's got to be careful, because if he doesn't specify the very thing that they have asked him to revive, and he simply says, come out, then every single dead person on the hillside would leap up out of the grave. Because if he simply says, come out, then everybody who's dead will be made alive just like that. That's his power. So he has to specifically say, Lazarus, it's you today. Come out. That's the power of our God, which means, as he says, come out in a room like this, that every single tomb and every single heart that's got its own personal Lazarus in it has to start getting up out of the tomb and walking, stinking and smelly and revived nonetheless, because Jesus' power is that powerful, and he's that able to bring anything in your soul that's dead back to life. And he comes out of the tomb. I guarantee you, Mary and Martha probably thought, man, it would have been cool to have a healing of our sick brother in the beginning of the story. But now I know how powerful you are, because we've had a resurrection on the backside of the story. Maybe something is diseased right now and looks like it's dying. Jesus has not denied your request. He can come in and he can revive every place in your soul. That's the power of our God. When Jesus calls your name, he breaks the silence in your soul, and he brings everything out that has been tuned inside your heart. Now we say, come, Holy Spirit. As I've been talking, a lot of you felt like he's talking right at me. This thing's dormant. I gave up on it a long time ago. I say, even if and even when, it's now. Even now, I know that God will give you everything. Martha says that you asked Jesus. What's that thing that God is saying, I can do that you thought I could not do? He didn't cause it, but he can work with it. On the back end of the story, he's speaking directly. Just put your name where Lazarus is in, and he says, come out. When you send the request, God begins to send his Spirit to move deeply in your soul. Thanks for watching. Head over to vividchurch.com so that you can stay updated with all things Vivid Church. Join us in person or online for one of the services so that you can be a part of our Vivid Church family. But don't stop there. Please share this video so that we can help other people live the vivid story that God has for them. Thank you.